It was April 1945, the final collapsing weeks of the Second World War. The world was shaking under the weight of a storm that had lasted 6 relentless years, and on the eastern edge of a small German village near the Elbe River, a group of exhausted German women, nurses, clerks, farm helpers, even mothers, stood in the cold morning air with their hands raised, their uniforms stained, torn, and stripped of meaning. Overnight, they had gone from serving their collapsing regime to standing as prisoners of war, accused, judged, and now awaiting a fate they could not predict. A thin fog crawled over the ground, curling around their boots and rising like a silent witness. The air stank of smoke, burned timber, scorched earth, and the metallic scent of spent ammunition. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled like thunder rolling across a broken sky. The village itself felt frozen in time, windows shattered, roofs blown open, and the fields trampled under the boots of armies that had passed through only hours earlier. Now, only the wind moved freely, brushing against the women's faces, cold as the fear tightening their throats. American soldiers stood opposite them, rifles poised, not in rage, but in rigid caution. For the German women, the sight of those rifles felt like the edge of destiny itself. Every second was heavy, stretched thin by dread and uncertainty. Some of the women whispered prayers. Some stared straight ahead, refusing to tremble. Others blinked rapidly, trying to hold back the tears fighting to escape. And in that fragile space, between defeat and judgment, between fear and mercy, the story began. Carried by the trembling breath of history itself, the march toward the far edge of the field began in silence, an unnatural, suffocating silence that pressed against the ears like the weight of water. Not even the wind dared to speak. The German women started forward hesitantly, their steps trembling and uneven at first, as though the earth itself resisted, carrying them toward whatever waited beyond the broken hedges. Their boots, worn, stiff, and soaked through with cold dew, sank slightly into the soft spring soil with every step. The ground was uneven, torn open by tank tracks and artillery blasts, pockmarked with shell impacts that had transformed the once lush farmland into a scarred patchwork of mud and shattered roots. As they walked, the women tried not to look at the trench that lay ahead, though each one felt its presence in the pit of her stomach like a stone sinking into darkness. American soldiers flanked them on both sides, walking in steady formation. Their rifles were held in disciplined readiness, not wavering, not threatening, but undeniably present, silent reminders of authority, victory, and judgment all at once. The clicking of metal parts, the shift of leather straps across shoulders, and the crunch of boots against broken earth formed a grim rhythm that filled the space where words should have been. Although none of the soldiers spoke, their eyes remained sharp, sweeping the horizon, the women, and the ruined countryside as though expecting danger to rise from the quiet itself. War had trained them to trust nothing, not even a group of exhausted, unarmed prisoners. The women kept their hands visible, fingers numb from the cold and stiff from tension. Some held their hands high, others kept them clasped together, trembling near their chests. Their uniforms, once pressed, once symbols of an empire that demanded obedience, were now pathetic, torn at the seams, stained with dirt, and heavy with weeks of sweat and fear. Strands of hair clung to their faces, matted by dried tears and smoke. Many had not slept properly in days. The collapse of the front, the chaos of retreating troops, and the roar of constant bombardments had left them in a daze, teetering between exhaustion and disbelief. But it was the silence that unsettled them most, Silence was not normal, not in April 1945. For 6 years, Europe had known nothing but the thundering soundtrack of destruction sirens, screams, mortar blasts, airplanes whining overhead, and the endless echo of marching boots. Silence felt like a lie, a trick, a hidden threat. Silence meant something terrible was about to happen. As they walked past the surviving trees, blackened by fire, stripped bare of branches, the women felt the eyes of the dead pressing on them from the ground below. The soil smelled of old gunpowder and fresh earth turned over by explosions. There was also another smell in the air, the faint, metallic scent of dried blood lingering from battles fought only hours earlier. But beneath that, drifting in gentle waves, was the scent of spring, wildflowers crushed underfoot, damp moss, and new grass pushing up stubbornly through the devastation. It was almost cruel, the contrast between the rebirth of nature and the destruction unleashed by mankind. A crow landed on a broken fence post nearby, its feathers glossy against the dull grey sky. It let out a single caw, harsh and accusing, before hopping along the post as the prisoners passed. Its black eyes followed them like a sentinel, as though bearing witness to the condemned as they walked to their fate. One of the younger women, no more than 18, flinched at the sound. She bit her lip hard enough to draw blood, tasting the copper on her tongue. Her boots were too large for her, borrowed from another soldier who no longer needed them. They thumped against her calves with every step. She whispered a prayer under her breath, words shaky and half forgotten, taught to her years ago by a grandmother who never lived long enough to see her dressed in a uniform. Another woman in the line was older, perhaps in her 30s, though war had carved a decade more into her face. She had once worked as a nurse in a field hospital, stitching wounds and holding dying men's hands as they begged for messages to be passed to families she would never meet. Her hands, once steady, now trembled uncontrollably. The horrors she had seen had robbed her of sleep, but today felt different. This felt final. She could smell the damp trench ahead even before she saw it, the earthy scent of freshly turned soil that had not yet dried beneath the weak sun. She kept her eyes down, watching her feet move one step after another, trying not to imagine the cold earth falling over her body. The soldiers said nothing, but one of them glanced briefly at the women with a look that wasn't hatred, but curiosity, like he was trying to understand how people not much different from himself had become the enemy. He looked away quickly, as though ashamed of the thought. War did not permit compassion, not openly, not comfortably. Compassion was something whispered after dark, something confessed in letters home, never in front of fellow soldiers. As the group approached the far edge of the field, the trench finally came into view. Long, shallow, and freshly dug. The rain from the night before had softened the soil, leaving streaks of wet clay clinging to the sides. A few puddles glistened at the bottom, reflecting the muted sky like dull mirrors. The sight struck something deep in the prisoners. Their breathing changed instantly. Short, sharp gasps, caught between panic and resignation. One woman's knees nearly buckled, but the woman beside her caught her arm, squeezing gently. Their eyes met. Two strangers bound by the same fear. The march halted on command. The sudden stop sent a ripple of motion through the line as the women steadied themselves, their breaths puffed in small clouds in the cold air. No one dared to wipe tears, even though several streams flowed freely down pale cheeks. Their bodies shivered not from the light wind, but from the instinctive terror that gripped their spines like a fist. The American sergeant stepped forward. His boots were worn, the leather scuffed and dusted with dried mud. His uniform was stained from days in the field, though it still hung with a certain authority. He carried himself like a man who had lived too many lifetimes inside a single war, shoulders heavy, eyes narrowed not in cruelty but in fatigue. He was not old, perhaps in his mid-30s, but war had etched deep lines across his brow and around his mouth. He carried the weight of command like an invisible stone strapped to his chest. He surveyed the line of women slowly, his gaze traveling from face to face. Some of the women tried to remain stoic, staring ahead with rigid spines, determined not to show fear. Others could not help trembling visibly, their lips quivering as tears streaked through the dirt on their faces. One woman clenched her jaw so tightly that her teeth ached, determined not to cry, not now, not in front of these soldiers, not before death. The sergeant's expression did not change. He remained unreadable, as though sealed behind a wall built from months of loss and responsibility. The women could not tell whether he saw them as prisoners, threats, burdens, or simply human beings caught in the wrong uniform at the wrong moment. A faint breeze stirred, lifting dust from the ground. It carried with it the distant sounds of war-muffled artillery, the occasional crack of gunfire from somewhere beyond the village, and the low rumble of engines. The world beyond the field was still burning, still tearing itself apart, still fighting battles even as the war neared its inevitable end. But here, in this small corner of collapsing Germany, everything felt suspended, history holding its breath as it watched the scene unfold. The sergeant took another step forward, the leather of his boots creaking softly. He stopped only a few feet from the women, close enough that they could smell the faint scent of tobacco lingering on his jacket, mixed with the sweat of long marches. He looked down at the trench behind him, then back at the prisoners. His jaw flexed slightly, as though he were grinding his teeth or swallowing words he wasn't ready to speak. One of the younger women squeezed her eyes shut, whispering again. Another reached up and touched the small locket hidden beneath her uniform. The last reminder of a family she did not know if she would ever see again. A third woman clenched her fists so tightly that her nails drew tiny crescents of blood into her palms. The sergeant raised one hand slowly, not in threat, but simply to signal his men to stand ready. The soldiers obeyed instantly, rifles shifting subtly, boots bracing in the dirt. The tension thickened until it felt like the air itself might snap. The women stood frozen, balanced on the razor edge between life and death. It was a moment suspended in the cold morning light, a moment that seemed to stretch far beyond the reach of clocks or calendars, a moment that would stay etched in memory long after the sounds of war faded. And then, as the field held its breath, time stopped. The sergeant did not speak at first. He only stared at the women, his breath rising faintly in the cold morning air. The tension that hung over the field grew heavier, as if gravity itself had thickened. Every prisoner felt it pressing against her ribs, squeezing her lungs, tightening around her throat. Even the soldiers standing guard, men hardened by years of fighting across continents, felt the weight of that silence. Most battles ended in noise, gunfire, explosions, screams. But this moment's stillness was worse. It gnawed at nerves, made fingers twitch on rifle triggers, made hearts stumble in their rhythm. The sergeant's face was cut from exhaustion, carved with lines of sleeplessness and grief. Dust clung to his jawline, and his eyes, grey, tired but sharp, moved slowly over the women. He did not look angry. He did not look triumphant. He looked like a man who had seen too many corpses, too many ruined towns, too many promises of peace after this, shattered again and again. His shoulders were tight beneath the weight of unspoken memories. Somewhere behind him, another soldier cleared his throat. A small, nervous sound instantly swallowed by the vast emptiness of the field. The rifles remained trained on the prisoners. Metal glinted dully in the thin morning light. The sound of a safety catch clicking into place echoed faintly. One of the women flinched. Her breath hitched in her chest, and her legs trembled so violently that she fought to keep herself upright. She was certain the trench behind the sergeant was meant for them. Why else would they have been marched here? Why else would the soldiers stand in firing formation? Her mind raced with images she could not bear. Images of her body falling, cold earth covering her face, nameless, forgotten. Another woman, older, worn from years of ration lines, bomb shelters, and nights spent listening to distant artillery, closed her eyes tightly. She didn't pray. She had prayed too many times during this war, and every prayer seemed swallowed by smoke. Instead, she tried to remember her children's faces. She tried to recall their laughter, the way they once ran through wheat fields before the war stole everything bright from their world. Her youngest son had golden curls. She feared she would forget that detail in her final seconds. Fear has a way of stealing memories, smothering them. She fought to hold on to it. The sergeant took in a long, slow breath. His chest rose and fell with a heaviness that suggested an internal struggle. One fought not with weapons, but with conscience. He looked down at the trench, freshly dug and waiting. Mud glistened inside. The symbolism was unmistakable. Executions were not uncommon in these final weeks. Chaos had stripped away rules, and desperation had blurred every boundary. Prisoners, especially those wearing enemy uniforms, were often seen as burdens, liabilities, or unfinished business of the war's cruelty. The sergeant glanced at his men. They were waiting for his order. Some kept their eyes straight ahead, unable or unwilling to look directly at the women. Others stared openly, faces blank but eyes conflicted. One soldier was young, too young, 17, maybe 18. His lips trembled as he tightened his grip on his rifle. He had never executed anyone before. He had fought battles, yes. He had seen combat, yes. But lining up unarmed prisoners, ending their lives in cold efficiency, that was different. That was a weight he was not sure he could carry. The wind stirred faintly, picking up grains of dirt and carrying them across the field. It brushed against the women's faces, sweeping strands of hair into their eyes. One woman lifted her shoulder instinctively to wipe her cheek, but froze halfway, afraid that any sudden movement, even one made out of discomfort, might be mistaken for resistance. Her heartbeat hammered so hard she felt it in her throat. The sergeant shifted slightly, boots pressing deeper into the soil. Every eye followed the motion. The prisoners' minds filled the silence with imagined commands. Aim. Ready. Fire. They braced for words that never came. Instead, the sergeant's gaze softened, almost imperceptibly. His brow furrowed, not in anger but in conflict. He exhaled a breath that sounded more like defeat than authority. No, he murmured. The word was quiet, but it cut through the tension like a blade. The soldiers blinked. A few exchanged confused glances. The prisoners stared, stunned. Had they heard correctly? Was it a refusal? A delay? A final cruel moment before the inevitable? The sergeant did not repeat himself immediately. He dragged a weary hand down his face, wiping away the grime collected there. The gesture was human, deeply painfully human. A gesture of a man tired of orders, tired of violence, tired of being the instrument of death when the war was clearly ending. Finally, he lifted his head and spoke louder, voice steady. "No, that's enough." A pause. "They're done. Take them back." Shock rippled through the field. One soldier hesitated, uncertain whether he had misunderstood. "Sarge." "I said take them back," the sergeant repeated, firmer this time. "No executions today." He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His tone carried a weight heavier than command. It carried finality. It carried exhaustion. It carried mercy forged from the realization that more blood, especially now, would change nothing. The women did not move. They were paralyzed, rooted in disbelief. Several stared at the sergeant with wide, unblinking eyes. It was as if they feared that blinking might break the fragile reality of what they had just heard. One woman, the young one with oversized boots, let out a shaky breath. Her legs gave way beneath her. She crumpled toward the ground, but not from pain, only from overwhelming relief. The soldier nearest to her stepped forward instinctively, reaching out as if to catch her, though he hesitated, unsure if touching a prisoner was allowed. She steadied herself before he could decide, pushing herself back upright, but her hands trembled uncontrollably. Another prisoner began to cry softly. At first she tried to hide it, biting her sleeve, turning her face away, but the tears came anyway, hot and unstoppable. The sound was small, but in the stillness it felt enormous. Her shoulders shook with sobs that she had held back for weeks, maybe months. A soldier looked away awkwardly, pretending not to notice. Another shifted uncomfortably. The sergeant avoided their eyes. He knew the power of the choice he had made, but he also knew its cost. Mercy in war was not a simple virtue, it was a burden. It meant accepting responsibility for sparing enemy lives. It meant questioning orders, questioning purpose, questioning the endless chain of violence that had become routine. He turned sharply, not wanting to witness the mix of gratitude and disbelief in the prisoners' faces. Gratitude in war felt almost unbearable. "Let's move," he said quietly to his men. The soldiers adjusted their rifles, but the tension had changed. Their stance softened, not by much, but enough that the prisoners felt the shift. The rifles were no longer instruments of imminent death. They were tools of escort, guard, containment. The march back to the ruined village began. This time, the footsteps sounded different. The earth still crunched beneath their boots, the wind still whistled across broken branches, and the crows still watched from their perches. But the dread that had weighed on the women's shoulders slowly, carefully, began to loosen. Their breaths came easier, though still ragged with shock. One woman looked over her shoulder at the trench fading behind them, the dark wound in the earth that could have swallowed them whole. It felt surreal that such a place would not become their grave. As they walked, the sergeant moved ahead of them. His silhouette cut a strong line against the bleak horizon, though his steps were heavy, dragged down by contemplation. What drove him to refuse the execution? Was it exhaustion? Was it something he saw in their faces? Was it simply the inability to add more deaths to a war already drowning in them? Maybe it was all those things. Maybe it was something simpler. He was tired of killing. The prisoners followed, each step filled with trembling disbelief. None dared to speak. The silence was still sacred, still fragile. One wrong sound felt like it could shatter the mercy that had been granted. They kept their eyes lowered. Some silently mouthed prayers of thanks. Others stared at the ruined village ahead, wondering how the world could still exist after what they had almost experienced. The trench behind them disappeared into the fog, but the memory of it, and the mercy that stopped it from becoming their final resting place, would never fade. The women were guided back into the shattered remains of the village with slow, unsteady steps, their bodies weakened by the adrenaline crash that followed the unimaginable moment they had just survived. The road leading into the village was lined with debris, broken wagons, charred beams, fallen roof tiles, and the twisted remains of metal tools left behind in the hurried evacuation when the front collapsed. Every corner of the village carried the scars of war. Stone walls were pocked with bullet holes. Windows were shattered, glass glittering faintly in the morning light like scattered ice. Smoke drifted lazily from a collapsed barn, curling upward in faint grey ribbons that mixed with the pale sky. The American soldiers walked ahead and behind them, but the atmosphere had shifted. The earlier tension, sharp, heavy, suffocating, had eased into something quieter, something almost reflective. Though the rifles remained in hand, they were no longer pointed with the same rigid vigilance. The soldiers had witnessed the sergeant's decision. They had felt the weight of it, even if none of them spoke about it. The prisoners were assembled near the remains of a stone farmhouse, its walls cracked, but still standing. Portions of the roof had caved inward, leaving gaping holes through which sunlight streamed, illuminating dust particles drifting lazily like tiny floating embers. The women sat where they were told, on broken crates, on pieces of collapsed walls, on the cold ground. Some sat with their arms wrapped tightly around themselves, trying to calm the shaking that refused to stop. Others simply stared at the ground, their eyes wide, unfocused, haunted by the trench they had expected would be the last thing they ever saw. One woman reached up and touched her own face with trembling fingers, almost as if checking whether she still existed. Another ran her hands slowly through her tangled hair, her palm brushing away dried tears and streaks of dirt. The simple act of sitting, something so ordinary, felt foreign now, surreal, as if her body had forgotten the meaning of rest. The silence among the women was profound, not oppressive like before. This silence was different. It was a silence heavy with realization, with processing, with the fragile awareness that they had crossed the threshold of death and stepped back somehow. Relief and shock clashed inside each of them like two storms colliding. The soldiers stood at a distance, forming a loose perimeter. Their posture was no longer hostile. Instead, they watched the women the way one watches a fragile object, aware that it could break at the slightest touch. Some of them exchanged glances, small nods, tiny gestures of acknowledgement that something extraordinary had happened in that field. Others avoided looking at the women altogether. Their thoughts turned inward, grappling with questions they did not know how to answer. The sergeant stood apart from everyone, leaning lightly against the remnants of a half-collapsed wall. He removed a cigarette from his pocket, his fingers steady now that the decision was behind him. He struck a match, shielding the flame with his cupped hand. For a moment, the tiny spark seemed impossibly bright against the muted colors of the destroyed village. He inhaled deeply, the cigarette burning orange at the tip, and then let out a long exhale, a slow stream of smoke drifting upward, merging with the dust and morning air. His expression was not proud. It was not relieved. It was thoughtful, shadowed, complicated. The lines on his face deepened as he stared out at the ruins. He looked like a man asking himself a question he had no answer for. He might have wondered if he had made the right choice. He might have wondered what his commanding officers would say if they learned he had disobeyed the expectation of harshness that hung over war. Or perhaps he wondered what the world would become after all this destruction. What place mercy would have in a world that had forgotten the meaning of it. He took another slow drag of the cigarette, his hand steady but his eyes distant. The smoke curled around his features, blurring the sharpness of his profile, softening him into something almost ghost-like. The war had taken pieces of him, pieces that could never be returned. And in that moment, he seemed painfully aware of it. A few meters away, one of the women watched him quietly. Not with anger, not with fear, but with a kind of stunned gratitude that she struggled to process. She did not know his name. She did not know his past, his story, or his reasons. All she knew was that because of him, she still breathed. Because of him, she still had a future, whatever that future might be. Another woman stared at her own hands, turning them over slowly, examining the small cuts. The dirt wedged beneath her fingernails, the faint shaking she couldn't seem to control. She wondered how it was possible that these hands that once cooked meals, wrote letters, held children, had nearly become lifeless. She wondered how close she had come to disappearing into a trench in a field far from home, with no one left to know her final moments. Inside the farmhouse ruin, the remaining fragments of life before the war lay scattered. A broken ceramic bowl, half a wooden chair leg, a child's carved toy, its paint faded and chipped. These traces of ordinary life contrasted painfully with the reality outside. One of the younger women stared at the toy for a long moment, imagining the child who once played with it. Imagining the laughter, the innocence, the world that existed before uniforms and weapons and orders tore everything apart. A soft murmuring began among the villagers who had remained behind. They gathered in doorways and behind broken fences, peering toward the group of women and soldiers. These villagers had survived the front's collapse only by hiding, waiting, praying that the storm of war would pass over them. Now, they whispered to each other, their faces marked with disbelief. Mercy was not something they expected to witness at this stage of the war. Executions had become common, especially as fear and bitterness reached their peak. But today, something different had happened, something rare. One elderly man, leaning heavily on a cane fashioned from a broken beam, watched with solemn eyes. His village had been torn apart, his family scattered, his home destroyed. Yet as he looked at the prisoners, women who were technically the enemy, he felt something stir in him. Recognition, perhaps. Compassion. The simple understanding that suffering was universal, that grief belonged to all sides, that everyone had lost pieces of themselves in this vast tragedy. The sergeant continued smoking, still apart from his men. His shoulders slumped slightly, as if he carried a weight that the cigarette could not ease. He was thinking, digging through the layers of his conscience, his memories, his exhaustion. He might have recalled comrades lost in battle. He might have remembered civilians caught in crossfire. He might have thought about the brutality he had seen from both sides. War had a way of stealing moral clarity, leaving only grey shadows where right and wrong used to be. One of his soldiers approached him slowly, hesitantly. The young one, the boy with the trembling hands. "Sarge," he said quietly, almost respectfully. The sergeant took a final drag, flicked the cigarette butt onto the ground, and crushed it under his boot. "Yeah, you really think it was right, what we did?" The sergeant's gaze drifted toward the group of women, sitting silently among the ruins. He watched them for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he said, "Kid, I don't know what's right in a war like this. I only know we've killed enough for one lifetime." The young soldier nodded, absorbing the words. They weren't an answer, but they were honest. And in war, honesty was rare. The villagers continued watching from a distance, some slowly stepping forward, others remaining in the shadows of their ruined homes. A woman in a stained dress clutched a child to her chest, staring with wide eyes at the soldiers and the prisoners. She whispered something to her son, but her voice was too soft to hear. Perhaps she told him that what he was seeing was important. Perhaps she told him to remember this moment when he grew older. Mercy, after all, was something children should learn early, especially in a world that had forgotten the meaning of it. A gentle breeze swept through the village, lifting dust into small whirling spirals. It brushed across the prisoners' faces, drying the last remnants of tears. Some closed their eyes briefly, feeling the air against their skin, grounding themselves in the simple, undeniable reality that they were alive. Life, a word that felt newly unfamiliar. The sun climbed a little higher, its pale light warming the stones of the farmhouse and glinting off the soldiers' helmets. It revealed details the darkness had hidden, the cracked texture of the walls, the rippling grain of broken wood, the small weeds that had already begun to grow through the rubble. Nature, indifferent to war, continued its slow, patient work of reclaiming what humans had destroyed. Inside the group, the women remained quiet, each lost in her own thoughts. One imagined returning home, if her home still stood. Another imagined writing to someone she loved, telling them she had survived. Another thought of nothing at all, her mind still trapped in the moment. She had stared into the possibility of her own death. The soldiers remained on guard, but their posture had softened into a stance of weary acceptance. They had seen enough horror to know that today had been different. Today, something had broken the cycle of violence, even if only for a moment, and the sergeant, still standing apart, still deep in contemplation, finally turned his gaze toward the sky. It was clearing now, the clouds drifting apart, revealing glimpses of blue. He watched the light shift, and for the first time in many days, he allowed himself a single thought that felt almost human, almost hopeful. Maybe this war would end soon. Maybe soon, soldiers could put down their weapons. Maybe soon, prisoners could go home. Maybe soon, the world could begin to rebuild itself from the ashes. The years later, some of the women would remember this morning not as the day they almost died, but as the day they witnessed something extraordinary. Proof that even crushed beneath the brutal machinery of war, humanity could still flicker like a stubborn flame refusing to be extinguished. Some would speak of the sergeant, though they never knew his name. Some would describe his wary eyes, his hesitation, the quiet conviction behind the simple word no. Others would speak of the village ruins, the rising smoke, the dust drifting through beams of sunlight. But all of them would remember the feeling, raw, overwhelming, that washed over them when they realized they would live. They would remember the relief. They would remember the trembling. They would remember the silence after mercy. And the world, still broken, still healing, would carry that small, fragile moment forward through time, reminding future generations that even in humanity's darkest hours, the choice to spare a life can echo louder than the thunder of war.